We continue Demosthenes from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. The first occasion of his eager inclination to oratory, they say, was this. Callistratus, the orator, being to plead in open court for Arapus, the expectation of the issue of that cause was very great, as well for the ability of the orator, who was then at the height of his reputation, as also for the fame of the action itself. Therefore Demosthenes, having heard the tutors and schoolmasters agreeing among themselves to be present at this trial with much importunity, persuades his tutor to take him along with him to the hearing, who, having some acquaintance with the doorkeepers, procured a place where the boy might sit unseen. And hear what was said. Callistratus, having got the day, and being much admired, the boy began to look upon his glory with a kind of emulation, observing how he was courted on all hands and attended on his way by the multitude. But his wonder was more than all excited by the power of his eloquence, which seemed able to subdue and win over anything. From this time, therefore, bidding farewell to other sorts of learning and study, he now began to exercise himself and to take pains in declaiming as one that meant to be himself also an orator. He made use of Esaias as his guide to the art of speaking, though Isocrates at that time was giving lessons, whether, as some say, because he was an orphan and was not able to pay Isocrates his appointed fee of 10 mina, or because he preferred Esaias's speaking as being more businesslike and effective in actual use. Hembippus says that he met with certain memoirs without any author's name, in which it was written that Demosthenes was a scholar to Plato. He learned much of his eloquence from him, and he also mentions Ctesibius as reporting from Callias and Syracuse and some others that Demosthenes secretly obtained a knowledge of the systems of Isocrates and Alcidamas and mastered them thoroughly. As soon, therefore, as he was grown up to a man's estate, he began to go to law with his guardians, and to write orations against them, who in the meantime had recourse to various subterfuges and pleas for new trials. And Demosthenes, though he was thus, as Thucydides says, taught his business in dangers, and by his own exertions was successful in his suit, was yet unable for all this to recover so much as a small fraction of his patrimony. He only attained some degree of confidence in speaking, and some competent experience in it, and having got a taste of the honor and power which are acquired by pleadings, he now ventured to come forth and to undertake public business, and as it is said of Laomedon, the Archomenian, that by advice of his physician he used to run long distances and keep off some disease of his spleen, and by that means, having, through labor and exercise, framed the habit of his body, and betook himself to the great Garland games, and became one of the best runners at the long race. So it happened to Demosthenes, who, first venturing upon oratory for the recovery of his own private property, by this acquired ability in speaking, and at length in public business, as it were in the great games, came to have the preeminence of all competitors in the assembly. But when he first addressed himself to the people, he met with great discouragement, with long sentences, and tortured with formal arguments, to a most harsh and disagreeable excess, Besides, he had, it seems, a weakness in his voice, a perplexed and indistinct utterance and shortness of breath, which, by breaking and disjointing his sentences, much obscured the sense and meaning of what he spoke, so that in the end, being quite disheartened, he forsook the assembly, and as he was walking carelessly and sauntering about the Piraeus, Eudamus, the Thracian, then a very old man, seeing him, upbraided him, saying that his diction was very much like that of Pericles, and that he was wanting to himself through cowardice and meanness of spirit, neither bearing up with courage against the popular outcry, nor lifting his body for action, but suffering it to languish through mere sloth and negligence. Well, Pericles was an entity that made Athens great again, but people, their political disputes, yeah, the dude wasn't perfect, but somebody wants to make your country great again, you kind of go along with the actuality of that, maybe not the phrase of the movement. There's another lives matter, and kill more people than any racist group ever did in this combined in a single year. Another time, well, I mean, racist against that group, but another time the assembly had refused to hear him, and he was going home with his head muffled up, taking it very heavily. They relate that Satyrus, the actor, followed him, and being the familiar acquaintance, entered into conversation with him, to whom when Demosthenes bemoaned himself, that having been the most industrious of all the pleaders, and having almost spent the whole strength and vigor of his body in that employment, he could not yet find any acceptance with the people, that drunken sots, mariners, and illiterate fellows were heard, and had the hustings for their own, when he himself was despised. You say true, Demosthenes, replied Satyrus, but I will quickly remedy the cause of all this, if you will repeat to me some passage out of Euripides or Sophocles, which, when Demosthenes had pronounced, Satyrus, presently taking it up after him, gave the same passage in his rendering of it such a new form by accompanying it with proper mien and gesture, that to Demosthenes it seemed quite another thing. By this, being convinced how much grace and ornament language acquires from action, he began to esteem it a small matter, and as good as nothing for a man to exercise himself in declaiming, if he neglected enunciation and delivery. Hereupon he built himself a place to study in underground, which was still remaining in our time, and hither he would come constantly every day to form his action and exercise his voice. And here he would continue, oftentimes without intermission, 2 or 3 months together, shaving one half of his head, that so for shame he might not go abroad, though he desired it ever so much. Now, Eminem is probably one of the ones most known for doing this diction and enunciation thing to style his speech. In a deliberate manner. Nor was this all, but he also made his conversation with the people abroad, his common speech, and his business subservient to his studies, taking from hence occasions and arguments as matter to work upon, for as soon as he was parted from his company, down he would go at once into his study and run over everything in order that had passed, and the reasons that might be alleged for and against it. Any speeches also that he was present at, he would go over again with himself and reduce into periods, and whatever others spoke to him, or he to them, he would correct, transform, and vary several ways, Hence it was that he was looked upon as a person of no great natural genius, but one who owed all the power and ability he had in speaking to labor and industry. Of the truth of which it was thought to be no small sign that he was very rarely heard to speak upon the occasion, but though he were by name frequently called upon by the people as he sat in the assembly, yet he would not rise unless he had previously considered the subject and came prepared for it, so that many of the popular pleaders used to make it a jest against him, and Pythias once, scoffing at him, said that his arguments smelt of the lamp, to which Demosthenes gave the sharp answer, "It is true indeed, Pythias, that your lamp and mine are not conscious of the same things." To others, however, he would not much deny it, but would admit frankly enough that he neither entirely wrote his speeches beforehand, nor yet spoke wholly extempore, and he would affirm that it was the more truly popular act to use premeditation, such preparation being a kind of respect to the people, whereas to slight and take no care how what is said is likely to be received by the audience shows something of an oligarchical temper, and is the course of one that intends force rather than persuasion. Of his want of courage and assurance to speak offhand, they make it also another argument that, when he was at a loss and discomposed, Demosthenes would often rise up on the sudden to support him, but he was never observed to do the same for Demosthenes. Whence, then, may some say, was it that Aeschylus speaks of him as a person so much to be wondered at for his boldness in speaking, or how could it be when Python the Byzantine with so much confidence and such a torrent of words inveighed against the Athenians, that Demosthenes alone stood up to oppose him, or when Lamarcus the Mauritanian had written a panegyric upon King Philip and Alexander, in which he uttered many things in reproach of the Thebans and the Olympians at the Olympic Games, recited it publicly. How was it that he, rising up and recounting historically and demonstratively what benefits and advantages all Greece had received from the Thebans and Chalcidians, and, on the contrary, what mischiefs the flatterers of the Macedonians have brought upon it, so turned the minds of all that were present, that the sophist, in alarm at the outcry against him, secretly made his way out of the assembly, but Demosthenes, it should seem, regarded other points in the character of Pericles to be unsuited to him, but his reserve and his sustained manner, and his forbearing to speak on the sudden, are upon every occasion, as being the things to which principally he owed his greatness, that he followed and endeavored to imitate, neither wholly neglected the glory which present occasion offered, nor yet willing to expose his faculty to the mercy of chance. For in fact the orations which were spoken by him had much more of boldness and confidence in them than those that he wrote, if we may believe Eratosthenes, Demetrius the Phalerian, and the comedians. Eratosthenes says that often in his speaking he would be transported into a kind of ecstasy, and Demetrius that he uttered the famous metrical adjuration to the people: "By the earth, the springs, the rivers, and the streams." As a man inspired and beside himself, one of the Comedians calls him a Perithros, outside of something, I don't, and another scoffs at him for his use of antithesis, and what he took back, a phrase to please the very fancy of Demosthenes, unless indeed this also is meant by Epiphanes for a jest upon the speech on Holonesus, which Demosthenes advised the Athenians not to take at Philip's hands, but to take back. All, however, used to consider Demosthenes in the mere use of his natural gifts, an orator impossible to surpass, and that in what he spoke on the sudden he excelled all the study and preparations of Demosthenes, and Ariston the Chian has recorded a judgment which Theophrastus passed upon the orators, for being asked what kind of orator he accounted Demosthenes, he answered, worthy of the city of Athens. And then what he thought of Demosthenes, he answered, above it. And the same philosopher reports that Polyeuctus, the Sphatian, one of the Athenian politicians about that time, was wont to say that Demosthenes was the greatest orator, but Phocion the ablest, as he expressed the most sense in the fewest words, and indeed it is related that Demosthenes himself, as often as Phocion stood up to plead against him, would say to his acquaintance, here comes the knife to my speech. Yet it does not appear whether he had this feeling for his powers of speaking, or for his life and character, and meant to say that one word or nod from a man who was really trusted would go further than 1,000 lengthy periods from others. Demetrius the Phalerian tells us that he was informed by Demosthenes himself, now grown old, that the ways he made use of to remedy his natural bodily infirmities and defects were such as these: his inarticulate and stammering pronunciation he overcame and rendered more distinct by speaking with pebbles in his mouth. His voice he disciplined by declaiming and reciting speeches or verses when he was out of breath, while running or going up steep places, and that in his house he had a large looking-glass, before which he would stand and go through his exercises. It is told that someone once came to request his assistance as a pleader, and related how he had been assaulted and beaten. Certainly, said Demosthenes, nothing of the kind can have happened to you. Upon which the other, raising his voice, exclaimed loudly, what, Demosthenes? Nothing has been done to me? Ah, replied Demosthenes, now I hear the voice of one that has been injured and beaten. Of so great consequence toward the gaining of belief did he esteem the tone and action of the speaker. The action which he used himself was wonderfully pleasing to the common people, but by well-educated people, as for example by Demetrius the Phalerian, it was looked upon as a mean, humiliating, and unmanly thing. And Hermippus says of Asian that being asked his opinion concerning the ancient orators and those of his own time, he answered that it was admirable to see with what composure and in what high style they addressed themselves to the people, but that the orations of Demosthenes, when they are read, certainly appear to be superior in point of construction, and more effective. His written speeches, beyond all question, are characterized by austere tone and by their severity. In his extempore retorts and rejoinders he allowed himself the use of jest and mockery. When Demosthenes said, "Demosthenes, teach me," so might the sow teach Minerva. He replied, "What is this, Minerva, that was lately found playing the harlot in Calotus, when a thief, who had the nickname of the Brazen, was attempting to upbraid him for sitting up late and writing by candlelight? I know very well," said he, "that you had rather have all the lights out. And wonder not, O ye men of Athens, at the many robberies which are committed, since we have thieves of brass and walls of clay. But on these points, though we have much more to mention, we will add nothing at present. We will proceed to take an estimate of his character from his actions and his life as a statesman. His first entering into public business was much about the time of the Phocian War, as himself affirms, and may be collected from his Philippa orations. For none of these, some were made after that action was over, and the earliest of them refer to its concluding events. It is certain that he engaged in the occasion of the Medius, when he was but 32 years old, having as yet no interest or reputation as a politician. And this it was, I consider, that induced him to withdraw the action and accept a sum of money as a compromise, for of himself he was no easy or good-natured man, but of a determined disposition, and resolute to see himself righted. However, finding it a hard matter, and above his strength, to deal with Medius, a man so well secured on all sides with money, eloquence, and friends, he yielded to the entreaties of those who interceded for him. But had he seen any hopes or possibility of prevailing, I cannot believe that 3,000 drachmas could have taken off the edge of his revenge. The object which he chose for himself and the commonwealth was noble and just, the defense of the Grecians against Philip, and in this he behaved himself so worthily that he soon grew famous, and excited attention everywhere for his eloquence and courage in speaking. He was admired through all Greece. The king of Persia courted him, and by Philip himself he was more esteemed than all the other orators. His very enemies were forced to confess that they had to do with a man of mark. For such a character even Ascanius and Aperides gave him, where they accuse and speak against him, so that I cannot imagine what ground the Pompous had to say that Demosthenes was of a fickle, unsettled disposition, and could not long continue firm either to the same men or the same affairs, whereas the contrary is most apparent. For the same party and post in politics which he held from the beginning, to these he kept constant to the end, and was so far from leaving them whilst he lived that he chose rather to forsake his life than his purpose. Of course, your purpose goes beyond, should go beyond person and party, but he was neither heard to apologize for shifting sides, like Demosthenes, who would say he often spoke against himself, but never against the city, nor as Melanopus, who, being generally against Callistratus, but being often bribed with money, was wont to tell the people, "The man, indeed, is my enemy, but we must submit for the good of our country." Nor again as Nicodemus the Messenian, who having first appeared on Cassander's side, and afterwards taken part with Demetrius, said the two things were not in themselves contrary, it being always most advisable to obey the conqueror. We have nothing of this kind to say against Demosthenes, as one who would turn aside or prevaricate, either in word or deed. Lie. There could not have been less variation in his public acts if they had all been played, so to say, from first to last, from the same score. Panaetius, the philosopher, said that the most of his orations are so written as if they were to prove this one conclusion, that what is honest and virtuous is for itself only to be chosen, as that of the crown, that against aristocrats, that for the immunities and the philippics, in all which he persuades his fellow citizens to pursue, not that which seems most pleasant, easy, or profitable, but declares over and over again that they ought in the first place to prefer that which is just and honorable before their own safety and preservation. Now, often what's most pleasant and all that in the moment isn't in the long run, so yeah. So that if he had kept his hands clean, if his courage for the wars had been answerable to the generosity of his principles and the dignity of his orations, he might deservedly have his name placed, not in the number of such orators as Moerocles, Polyeuctus, and Hyperidas, but in the highest rank with Cimon, Thucydides, and Pericles. Certainly among those who were contemporary with him, Phocion, though he appeared on the less commendable side in the Commonwealth, and was counted as one of the Macedonian party, nevertheless, by his courage and his honesty, procured himself a name not inferior to those of Ephialtes, Aristides, and Cimon, but Demosthenes, being neither fit to be relied on for courage in arms, as Demetrius says, nor on all sides inaccessible to bribery. For how invincible soever he was against the gifts of Philip and the Macedonians, yet elsewhere he lay open to assault, and was overpowered by the gold which came down from Susa and Ecbatana, was therefore esteemed better able to recommend than to imitate the virtues of past times, and yet, excepting only Phocion, even in his life and manners, he far surpassed the other orators of his time. None of them addressed the people so boldly. He attacked the faults and opposed himself to the unreasonable desires of the multitude, as may be seen in his orations. The pompous writes that the Athenians, having by name selected Demosthenes, and called upon him to accuse a certain person, he refused to do it, upon which the assembly, being all in an uproar, he rose up and said, "Your counselor, whether you will or no, O ye men of Athens, you shall always leave me, but a sycophant or false accuser, though you would have me, I shall never be." And his conduct in the case of Antiphon was perfectly aristocratical, whom, after he had been acquitted in the assembly, he took and brought before the court of Areopagus, and setting at naught the displeasure of the people, convicted him there of having promised Philip to burn the arsenal, whereupon the man was condemned by that court and suffered for it. He accused also Theoris, the priestess, among other misdemeanors, of having instructed and taught the slaves to deceive and cheat their masters, for which the sentence of death was passed upon her, and she was executed. No. If their needs are provided for, it's one thing, but if their wants are what they're after, the oration which Apollodorus made use of, and by it carried the cause against Timotheus the general, in an action of debt, it is said, was written for him by Demosthenes, as also those against Phormion and Stephanus, in which latter case he was thought to have acted dishonorably, for the speech which Phormion used against Apollodorus was also of his making, as he, as it were, having simply furnished two adversaries out of the same shop with weapons to wound one another, of his orations addressed to the public assemblies, that against Androtion, and those against Timocrats and aristocrats were written for others, before he had come forward himself as a politician. They were composed, it seems, when he was but 7 or 8 and 20 years old, that against Aristogiton, and that for the immunities he spoke himself at the request, as he says, of Ctesippus, the son of Chabrias, but, as some say, out of courtship to the young man's mother, though, in fact, he did not marry her, for his wife was a woman of Samos, as Demetrius the Magnesian writes in his book on persons of the same name. It is not certain whether his oration against Ascinus for misconduct as ambassador was ever spoken, though Idomeneus says that Ascinus wanted only 30 voices to condemn him, but this seems not to be correct, at least so far as may be conjectured from both their orations concerning the crown, for in these neither of them speaks clearly or directly of it as a cause that ever came to trial, but let others decide this controversy. It was evident, even in the time of peace, what course Demosthenes would steer in the commonwealth, for whatever was done by the Macedonians he criticized and found fault with, and upon all occasions was stirring up the people of Athens and inflaming them against him. Therefore, in the court of Philip, no man was so much talked of, or of so great an account as he. And when he had come thither, one of the 10 ambassadors who were sent into Macedonia, though all had audience given them, yet his speech was answered with most care and exactness. But in other respects Philip entertained him not so honorably as the rest, neither did he show him the same kindness and civility with which he applied himself to the party of Ascinus and Philocrates, so that when the others commended Philip for his able speaking, his beautiful person, nay, and also for his good companionship in drinking, Demosthenes could not refrain from cavilling at these praises. The first, he said, was a quality which might well enough become a rhetorician, the second a woman, and the last was only the property of a sponge. No one of them was the proper commendation of a prince. And I guess that's where I stop today.